Okay, so I've done a hero side for this week. Now a villain side. Ironically, Helmut Zemo, or Baron Zemo, has got a ridiculously long history in comparison to Prometheus. But the sad thing ends up being, I have to pull up my sheet here real quick. But the sad thing, of course, ends up kind of being Prometheus being a walking Deus Ex Machina with his helmet, taking on Baron Zemo, who has got a lot of ridiculously fantastic physical abilities. And I decided to not give Baron Zemo the Moonstones. It has been noted that over time you do begin to also absorb some of the residual powers of the Moonstones, so that will come into play, but giving him direct access to a Moonstone will give him control over small levels of molecular manipulation, gravity, really enhanced super speed, super strength, durability, and that almost makes him almost more like metahuman level against somebody who's just a genius who has a helmet that helps him decipher and figure out what to do to defeat almost any opponent. So I decided that they'd probably be fighting over the Moonstones. Actually, the Moonstone, because the second one's been destroyed. So let's get right into this. Intelligence. Baron Zemo is one of those people. He very influential. He essentially is kind of like modern era super Nazi. So chemical genius. The guy knows his stuff phenomenally well. Versus a guy who developed a program that allows him to take information about any superhero or supervillain, transfer it onto a disk, which is weird that he's still using disks. You think by now he'd be using like jump drives, or he'd be using the cloud. Prometheus right now probably has a cloud of everyone's information that you just download straight into his helmet. So that's what you're comparing. You're comparing someone who's got a phenomenal chemical background, a lot of that hewn from some of the other Zemos, versus a guy who developed a program that allows him to take information from almost anywhere, create a near infinite supply of weapons on his personage to battle people. I have to give intelligence that is definitely Prometheus. Just the fact that he has a level of planning that is that precise and is entirely done inside a helmet. At the same time, if something happens to that helmet, he's kind of useless. Okay, fighting ability. Prometheus, again, can use his helmet to program in the top 30 greatest martial artists of all times. Which is pretty good, but Baron Zemo's gone toe-to-toe with Captain America. And it's just a shade below Captain America in overall fighting ability. And when Captain America fought Prometheus, he made short work of him. So if Captain America can pretty easily beat Prometheus, because everything Prometheus tries to throw at him, using neural chaff and disorientating lights, didn't really affect him that much. So you've got a guy who would use all of his different abilities to his advantage, versus a guy who can straight up fight and wields an adamantium sword. And is second to like Captain America. I have to give fighting to Zemo. Because when it comes to Prometheus, if anything happens at all to the helmet that he's wearing, his fighting abilities are gone. Remember, Batman was able to throw a small virus into it that gave him the abilities of Stephen Hawking when it came to fighting. So he's really close to having ridiculously awesome skills and none. Really fast. Strength. I was reading that the Moonstones over time will give you a slight augmentation in your abilities. So on one side you've got Prometheus, who at best is human strength, versus a guy who has human strength and a slightly more advanced slight enhancement from the Moonstones. Speed. They're both relatively about the same. Again, I'll give this one to Prometheus because of the helmet will give him enhanced reaction time. Like we saw in Cry for Justice, he was actually able to defeat a lot of people relatively fast. He did a really good job when it came to a lot of those sorts of things. At the same time, he didn't know how to dodge an arrow. And was able to have a one-on-one issue while fighting Arsenal or Red Arrow. So, but overall, if you got someone who's got advanced age, who's only young due to a chemical, versus a guy who's actually fairly well in his prime. Durability, both looking at humans here. However, one person has chemically enhanced longevity. Invulnerability. One guy got beaten up and then shot by an arrow and died. One guy has taken a tremendous amount of beatings. So that's you of a guy who would actually wear a level of armor in Baron Zemo versus Prometheus, who if he were to actually wear armor, as opposed to rely solely on his helmet, probably wouldn't have taken an arrow and then just died. You don't think that the helmet, full of all this advanced technology, would also be fairly solid? It's not. So you have a guy who wears almost no armor versus a guy who would wear some level of tactical armor. Energy projection, or distance fighting. You know, over here, Baron Zemo is great with rifles. Over here, you got a guy who uses, you know, neural chaff grenades, energized nightsticks, a whole just ridiculous arsenal on his personage. Even if, you know, like mini rockets, grenades, everything you can think of. Over here, rifles and adhesive X. So just based off of the amount of different things you can kick out with Prometheus, he gets it for the distance fighting. Versatility. Lots and lots of actual background training versus a helmet that allows him to do a lot of stuff. You know, he can pretty much if he can figure out enough about Zemo, he could probably defeat him using the helmet. So we're now tied up. You know, you've got some abilities over here, some abilities over here. Comes down to the overall X factor. Prometheus's greatest strength is also his biggest weakness. It's that helmet. If anything happens to the helmet, if the helmet happens to get hit, chipped, damaged, a virus, if an EMP goes off, his helmet is entirely useless. With no helmet, Helmut Zemo easily takes him down. Prometheus has a crutch, and that crutch is his helmet. We saw in Cry for Justice, he was doing phenomenal. He took out everybody in the league in essentially panels. And then what happened? The Shade showed up. Helmet? He appears to be a villain. Helmet? You didn't download the villain expansion software. Oh. He appears to be shadow-based. Like, or when he was fighting Batman. He's like, I'll beat you this time, Batman. I've got the 30 greatest. Okay. What'd you do to me? Oh, I gave you the Stephen Hawking's add-on. It's Prometheus. If the helmet doesn't malfunction, has a really good shot against Baron Zemo. However, if anything at all happens to that helmet, Helmut Zemo is going to defeat it.